Hello. Hi, this is Kevin Page. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. I am a partner. My institute is a partner with something called the Recovery Project. And it's a consortium of think tanks that includes Canada 2020, led by Tim Barber, a very progressive think tank in Canada, well known, and another very progressive think tank in Washington, D.C., the Center for Global Progress, led by Matt Brown. And so again, the purpose of this think tank really, or this consortium, is really to pull together people from different spectrums, political, non-political spectrums, economists, business people, really to start the conversation around the recovery. Like what happens, we're in the middle of this crisis, this public health crisis. There are big policy issues in terms of how do we manage our way through it, but there's also going to be big policy issues on the other side of it. And so today we're really very fortunate to have three incredible guests, and we're going to make good use of their talent and experience, and they cut across different domains, which is perfect for the Recovery Project. I'm going to start with Linda Nazareth, who is very well known as an economist with a great expertise in labor markets and demographics. She's a principal of a Relentless economics. She is a senior fellow for economics and population change at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I've read Linda's work over many, many years, particularly her work at the Globe and Mail. And she's got a book out that was published a couple years ago, Work is Not a Place, Our Lives and Our Organization in the Post-Jobs Economy. It's the perfect kind of book we should be reading when we're trying to wrap our heads around what does the labor market look like after this post-COVID pandemic. And then I'm going to just introduce a colleague, a friend, somebody that many of us work for as public servants, the Honorable Scott Brison. People know him from many domains, but this is a man, a politician from Nova Scotia, who I guess for the better part of 25 years, worked out of the riding of in Nova Scotia of King's Heart, and he
King's.
Go ahead, Scott.
King's Hands.
King's Hands. Sorry.
King's Hand.
King's Hand.
I have to defend the honor of my former constituents.
Well, you've always defended it very well, and that's why they kept re-electing you for the better part of 25 years. The Honorable Scott Brison. Scott is somebody who has experience, I guess like Mr. Anderson, I'll introduce in a minute, in different political parties, both as a conservative, but then as a liberal. Somebody that's worked in opposition as a finance critic, who I remember working closely with when I was the parliamentary budget officer, but also, also a cabinet minister of public works and government services, and of course a cabinet minister as president of the Treasury Board. And so Scott, in his current job, is the vice chair of investment and corporate banking at the Bank of Montreal. So he's kind of returned to his business roots. So Scott has these sort of significant big circles in his life, and so we're just honored to have somebody like Scott, because he brings business and political experience from many dimensions. And then finally, we're very blessed to have Rick Anderson. Thank you so much, Rick, for joining the webinar. Rick is very well known. I mean, we've all watched Rick on different media outlets, but he's been a political strategist for decades, and you don't need to apologize for that, Rick. But again, you worked for like Scott for liberal governments, for the Reform Party, played a crucial role through many campaigns, got a number of people elected across the country. We've all listened to you over the years, to your public commentary, but I think there's also an aspect. You've run a number of businesses, you sit on boards of businesses, you are a principal with Earnscliffe, and we're just so lucky to have you, Rick, to be part of this this discussion today. So the theme today that we want to discuss is restarting the economy. And I think it's definitely a prescient topic. I mean, some people, when we read the newspapers, they talk about easing the lockdown. Like, we're not totally restarting the economy yet. We're not like telling people to hop back to work for the most part. But you definitely see openings in certain sectors. More openings now in retail sectors. Talking about opening in some schools across the country, some recreational places, parks, etc. But again, so how do we like that connection between this crisis that we've lived in and to the recovery, to what happens after recovery is really, we have these three amazing panels today. So I think the first question that I would like to get at, and we could start with, we could start with Linda. Like, are we getting close to reopening the economy? What is your sense? Like, we've had some advice from public health officials, from the World Health Organization on a series of steps that are required to open the economy. Like, do you think, are we getting close? What really concerns you as we near that stage of kind of going back to work?
Yeah, I'm not even sure what reopening. We're talking about retail. You can shop online now, and when it does reopen, is anyone going to feel any more comfortable going out there? Are we going to have leisure shopping like we did? Same with restaurants. It doesn't really call to me when I hear about wearing a mask and having plexiglass and wiping everything down 4 times during the meal. It's going to take a long time before that seems like something I want to do. For other things, many of us are still. So I don't know. It's going to be a stop-start kind of process for a long time. I think even after we get the vaccine, there'll be a time before everyone's completely comfortable doing every single thing.
Yeah. So Scott, can we go to you? I know you're living in Montreal area for most of the school year with your family, with your daughters. You're spending some time in Nova Scotia as well. I mean, your sense, are we getting close to starting the economy? What are some of those critical steps that we need to kind of get to before we really start to open things up?
Well, governments right now are dealing with an unprecedented convergence of 2 crises, the public health crisis and the economic crisis. And the public health crisis is kind of like trying to get the airplane landed safely. And the economic and recovery project is kind of like getting the airplane off the ground again safely. And there's a real tension between the two because, some of the proponents of opening up the economy early on the basis of, protecting jobs and prosperity are also have to be quite cautious because any sustained recovery economically is contingent on the rate of infections continuing to go down and on there not being a second or third wave. So there's a real tension between those two. And I think as governments and financial institutions respond to this, it's important that we do everything we can to deal with that public health one thoroughly, because there will be no recovery until we have addressed that adequately. The other thing is to Linda's point, in jurisdictions that have reopened or are reopening, the participation rate in, for instance, retail shopping or restaurants, that kind of thing, people going out, has actually been quite low compared to before this. So this could be very much a new normal of what is being referred to as the 90% economy, with some sectors taking years and perhaps never getting back to where they were before.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. So Rick, like your sense of restarting the economy, the kind of steps that we need to take, maybe building on Linda and Scott's points, like are we close? And again, I should let our listeners know that, we're talking to you and you're in Vancouver.
It's a good question. I think that the interplay between the pandemic crisis, the virus, and the economic crisis, as Scott was just talking about, are really important here. And I don't think it's just a question of one takes off and the next one lands. They're going to be interacting with each other. To the point you were just making there, Kevin, I think in 8 of the 10 provinces, we are actually pretty close to the point where there's so few cases and so few new cases that, you know, the next stages of what the French call deconfinement, which is one of those great French words, better than what we found for it in English, I think so far, that the first steps of that could possibly be started now here in BC, in Saskatchewan, in Manitoba, in most of in all 4 of the Atlantic provinces, but not really in Ontario and Quebec. And maybe even in those places, you could regionalize this down to not in Montreal, but perhaps in the rest of Quebec. So we're at that point where, you know, kind of here in Vancouver, keeping people sort of immobilized is starting to lose its kind of salience because there's not that many cases around us to bump into. However, as we open the door to let people, you know, get out and be more mobile, I think what's going to be really important, you can see most of the provinces are talking in these terms of staging that so that we continue to try to keep people away from each other. We avoid density, we avoid crowds. So I think restaurants are going to be subject to, you know, 50% capacity limits or something like that. Airlines, more or less the same thing. I think the last, I'm about as frequent a flyer as you're going to find. The last thing I really want to do right now is get back on an airplane, particularly that crowded United one, that full United Airlines one I saw in the news this morning. You know, that's just asking for trouble. So I think we're going to have to find a new normal in stages while we proceed into moving out a little bit more, going to retail stores that have been closed and so on, but in limited numbers and in constrained fashion. And while we see how far we can take that before we get new cases breaking out and losing control. There's a story that everybody who's concerned about this question, how can we reopen safely, should look at. And it's what happened in South Korea over the last couple of weeks, where they started to end a lockdown and opened up restaurants and bars, including nightclubs. And one person went to three nightclubs on one night, and that infected people, which has turned into 40 known positives and 7,200 contacts that now need to be traced, which are going to yield more positive cases. So they've reclosed the bars in South Korea, and those folks are way ahead of Canada in terms of understanding the test, trace, isolate regime that is the way to, hopefully the way to reopen the economy in a safe fashion.
Thank you, Rick. So I think if we could, we'll just mix up the order for this.
Confidence.
Go ahead, Scott.
Just confidence is going to be incredibly important, and the return of confidence to citizens and consumers. You've got, you know, people cautious about their health and their kids' health. You've got people who are precariously employed, finding themselves more precariously employed today as a result of COVID-19. You've got personal debt levels in Canada at a record level, $1.60 for every dollar of annual income. So people aren't able to, consumers aren't inclined to leverage further or aren't able to leverage further. So I think this question of confidence, and I think it's really important that governments at all levels continue to have people's backs. This is a time when getting through this requires a level of confidence that people know they can depend on governments being there and helping them through what is a very scary period. If you're an American making less than $20,000 per year before this crisis, you were twice as likely to lose your job than somebody making over 80,000. So the level of fear and uncertainty for people who are already in tough financial straits is going to increase. And one of the things we're going to have to watch coming out of this is that this does not, that we are aware of the pressures on inequality that could emerge from this, and that could lead to all kinds of unintended consequences in terms of public policies responding to political pressures that could actually be quite damaging to the economy. So I think we've got to keep an eye on equality issues and not allow this to see a marked increase in inequality as a result of COVID-19.
So, yeah, thank you, Scott. So I'll go just to Linda now, just to pick up on Scott's point of confidence and change. And so you are one of Canada's sort of leading experts that, looks at the future of work and labor markets. And like on Friday, we got these almost shocking numbers from Statistics Canada. Even though some were expecting it, like we saw, in basically in 2 months with the labor force survey released for the April data, we saw that we shed some 3 million jobs, and we saw unemployment go up, if at least in 1 month by 1.5 million, which is like the population of of the city of Ottawa. So like, do you, from a point of view of somebody that looks at these trends of work, do you find like how does that impact of this higher unemployment affect confidence? And will, like, as we kind of work our way through to restarting the economy, will there be changes that you could accelerate that you were kind of tracking going into into the pandemic?
There's a lot of threads to what's going on, Kevin. It's really crazy that we had millions of jobs lost in the month of April, and yet the average wage went up above 10%. So average wages were more than 10% higher than they were a year ago. What happened is the jobs lost were those lower paid jobs, as Scott was alluding to earlier. So there's a lot of people who've been protected from this. My question is, will they continue to be protected? Because most full-time jobs, most jobs for highly educated people particularly, are still there. If that changes, we go from recession to a really deep recession, because those are the people who are holding up the economy to some extent while they can. That could be the next wave of that. So that really concerns me from a business cycle perspective. In terms of the trends we saw beforehand, yeah, we did see a move to the gig economy or the Hollywood model, sort of people coming in to do one job, leaving. I'm not necessarily against that. I think that could be an efficient way to work. However, we need to build in some kind of cushion for them when they're not working, or we need to educate ourselves how to save and get used to this model. And I don't think anybody was used to it when the economy got shut down. So we have a sort of crisis there. And as Scott says, this will make inequality much more of a thing. I talked a lot beforehand, not just of income disparities, but sort of as being the next really big crisis for us. And we're right there. We didn't think a pandemic would take us there, but that's what it was.
Thanks, Linda. So if I could go to Rick. So Rick, like you bring a lot of experience advising governments, advising businesses, running your own businesses over a number of different decades. I mean, we're seeing something like you and I have not seen, and nobody's really seen that's like, unless you were around sometime in the early 1900s and experienced the Spanish influenza. So like in terms of the shock to the economy, I've heard the metaphor like we're literally putting the economy in a freezer. And so then at some point in time, we have to take this economy out of the freezer. People talking about like declines in GDP in the second quarter of 20%. We're experiencing double-digit unemployment rates. Like, how do you think the government, and you talked about this tension, in managing that balance between public health and then, and kind of that connection to kind of growing the economy outside, and are we gonna have a hard time taking this economy out of the freezer?
Well, that's the $1 trillion question right now, and of course, confidence in this context means not just the usual consumer confidence or investor confidence or economic confidence that causes people to invest or to buy a house or to purchase things or to go out and consume services and so on. Confidence is also about safety, that the rules that we're going to have in place or the practices we'll follow in society will continue to keep us safe as we try to get us out of this deep freeze, as you put it. And to pick up on Linda's point, I think it's quite incredible what we're learning in this process about, in some ways, about the resilience of our economy. I know that's kind of a bizarre thing to be saying right now, but think of how many people actually are working. The unemployment numbers are, of course, shocking. And we need to fix that. but all of us who are doing this are probably working today in the capacities that we usually work at, not in the place that we usually do it. We're working from home, we're kind of immobilized, as I said. But many of the people who work in the services sector are continuing to work. I can call my lawyer today, I can call my banker, I can do banking by email, online, and so on. The things we're taking for granted that are continuing to work are kind of amazing. I mean, the telecoms that support the conversation we're having, the energy systems that keep the lights on, the grocery stores and the whole food supply chain, the whole energy infrastructure that keeps things working. Most of government, or parts of government that we interact with and need right now, are certainly working. The finance sectors, insurance and so on, investment markets, they're all kind of functioning not like normal. Universities and schools have shifted over to online platforms. I mean, there's humongous changes, some of which I think are going to stick with us, not in as dire a way as they have been imposed on us during the last couple of months. But I think some of these changed behaviors and changed practices are going to stick around. The delivery services are expanding. Amazon is expanding in the middle of this. And more people are getting used to talking to their kids and grandkids by Zoom than ever would have really tried to do that, just 60 days ago. So we're subjecting society to an undesired forced change, some of which is going to stick to us in terms of new practices, and some of which is also leading to new inequities that of the sort that Linda was talking about. I think it's bizarre that Walmart can stay open, whereas other clothing retailers and department stores can't, because Walmart has a grocery section in it, and the rules say if you're a grocery store, etc. That's an inequity that ultimately we kind of need to. If we're going to be in this boat for only a few more weeks, then I guess we don't need to fix it. We just need to get out of this boat. But if we're going to be in some version of this through a protracted period, maybe, as some people suggest, waves of recurrence of outbreaks and so on, then we're going to have to improve some of these rules for how how we decide what stays open and how it operates and what services we can use and so on, and to deal with the inequities that are resulting from that. But I think the changes that are underway are quite profound, and some of them are lasting.
Thank you very much, Rick. So Scott, you've sat around cabinet tables for many years in different portfolios, and certainly as president of Treasury Board, all these financial portfolios. Now we're seeing these incredible shifts in numbers. No one could have imagined a year or two ago we'd be talking about direct fiscal contributions, $150 billion range, hundreds of billions of dollars of liquidity sports, deficits, north of $200 billion. At what point, do you start, would a cabinet minister, a finance minister, a president of the Treasury Board start to think about, okay, so what does this look like on the other side? How am I going to manage this? Or do you just sort of, we'll wait till we get through the public health crisis? Well, we can afford this. How do you start to position government, on the other side of the pandemic?
Well, this is a very different crisis from 2008, but one of the things that it has in common with 2008 from a Canadian perspective is that our fiscal situation as a country is actually quite strong today. And it was also in 2008. We benefited from that. The advantage we have today is that long-term borrowing costs, I think, are around 0.6%, as opposed to around 3% back in 2008. So that's an advantage we have today. A disadvantage we have today, we don't have oil prices post 2008 really helped the Canadian economy. I don't think anyone really expects that to be as big a factor today. On the fiscal side, I think governments right now need to spend. They need to make sure that citizens and businesses of all sizes regain confidence to get through this. But at some point, we're going to have to wean people and businesses off this funding. And that is going to be the tricky part. We're going to see in the end of August, people are going to have to pay their taxes. Those have been deferred. Mortgage interest is being deferred for a lot of Canadians. A lot of Canadians and a lot of small businesses were highly indebted and were precariously financed heading into this. It's possible that over the next several months they'll get through this, but at some point there could very well be a spike in personal and business failures and bankruptcies. So this question of confidence is going to be really critically important. Now, some of the trends that Linda has written on and Rick was referring to, for instance, the adoption of digital technology to enable remote working. There's probably been more workplace and digital transformation in the last 8 weeks in big organizations like banks than would have been possible in 2 years under any other circumstance.
And
so
government.
a lot of these, or government. Well, as Canada's first minister of digital government, I fixed all that, Rick. Didn't you remember? I mean,
It just took a
everything's
while.
fine. Everything's fine now. But the reality is, though, things that were already occurring, but more gradually, like digital transformation, workforce transformation, robotics, automation, they're all happening gradually. Now they're happening at warp speed. And that is where the disruption comes in. And disruption makes people feel very uncomfortable, but at the same time, it could result in a much more efficient economy. Now, the challenge we have from a public policy perspective is governments seeking to insulate people from these changes will, for instance, put conditions on funding that goes to businesses that, they'll be tempted to do things like requiring businesses to maintain previous levels of employment in order to qualify for some of these benefits. I would argue that that could be a bad idea because, in fact, you want Canadian businesses to be efficient and effective. And where we should be focusing is in helping Canadians get through this. The CERB is part of it. I think we're going to have a robust discussion, and we should have a robust discussion around guaranteed annual income. And what that means in a current context, the working income tax benefit and the Canada Child benefit were in some ways trial projects that were in fact part of and contributed to, for all intents and purposes, a guaranteed annual income. The CERB is a form of guaranteed annual income. But the point is, governments giving people confidence to get through this it will really help restart the economy, but also prevent a political dynamic where citizens demand what would be economically dangerous ideas that would actually be very interventionist and damaging to business confidence ultimately. So I think we really need to make sure we're there for people and help them get through this, particularly the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Scott. Linda, so you've written on the way work has been changing in the lead up to the post-pandemic crisis, and there was transformations that Scott alluded to were taking place. Like, what is your sense? Like, will these transformations will there be this process of acceleration in terms of change over the next number of months until we get a vaccine? Do you think, and what do you see the role for governments and for educational sectors in order to promote healthy change in this regard?
It's a really difficult time, Kevin, because it makes a lot of sense to move to automation. We know that frontline workers are in danger. And we know there's been grocery workers infected. We know that in the US, particularly, there are transit workers who have died of COVID, didn't need to. You could have had automation doing some of those jobs. Same with the grocery stores. We know there's technology now that will come in and stack shelves, clean these stores, lots of technology that check things out. And I think stores are going to move to that very quickly. Just to take the grocery example, you're going to see it in lots of other sectors. That may make the workers safer. However, it will also take jobs. And that is going to be a very difficult line to be on either side of politically or just in terms of being an employer. But what do you want? You want to keep people safe and say, we won't put you on the front line at the same resource needs. And that's, going to be difficult. In terms of government, should they be going to a guaranteed income? I looked at numbers on this before the pandemic several times. I never saw numbers that made sense, that made it something we could do long term. If we were going to do that, we'd all have to buy into saying we're going to have fewer services. Maybe we're not going to have libraries. Maybe we're not going to have a lot of things we take for granted. You have to pay for those because we have to guarantee this income. Maybe we're going to be taxed more. Those are not easy things. And if we decide we're going to go there, it's a very, very powerful statement. Are we accepting there are some people who are not going to be in the labor force long term, who are just not employable anymore? I don't want to go there. I would like to think that we stop that from happening. It means a lot of educational initiatives early on. It means constant retraining, may mean companies, not just governments, but companies saying that they make a commitment to retrain people, even if it costs money and even if it makes a lot of effort. Canada's never been great at retraining. North America never has been. It's easier to get the right people and let go of the people you don't like, but we may have to change our mindset.
Yeah. So Rick, like on that point that where Linda just sort of left us, the conversations are going to shift from these fiscal supports dealing with the public health care crisis to recovery. And so like if you're advising governments, Canada and a lot of other countries in the same boat, we're now dealing with double-digit unemployment rates. Like how would you be shaping these sort of recovery package? Would unemployment be and training be a big part of your advice? Would public investment programs be a big part of your advice? Like what kind of advice would you be providing to governments as they start to shift their focus to recovery?
I would shift the focus sooner rather than later, because I think the income support programs, both for individuals and for businesses, the wage subsidy, the payroll subsidy programs for businesses, I think they've been very effective, but they're not sustainable in the long run. I mean, I think Scott's right. We can survive what we've done, but we shouldn't let it become a solid state. Because eventually we will run out of the ability to print money, and we'll end up with wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. That's what will happen if we all carry on down that road indefinitely. So we know we can't do that. It's common sense. It's also economic sense. So we need to start figuring out the economy, the recovery. We need to figure out how to get people into it safely and not to rush people into an unsafe, an economic recovery that's happening too quickly, and it just prompts a recurrence, a faster and a more severe recurrence of the virus, and gets us back to where we are right now. I'm very worried about the United States in this regard. I just think that the president actually, ironically, because we don't usually look to him for very well thought through public policy, if I can put it that way, actually has a pretty good list of criteria for when states should be unlocking their economies again. But almost nobody's paying any attention to what Washington is saying, and they're just going ahead and doing their own thing, and it's going to turn out badly, I'm sure, in some places. So we need to not have that happen. But what we should really also be doing is thinking about what the shape of the recovery should look like. I mean, one is, the pace of it, and, obviously as fast as we can safely do is, important for individuals and businesses and the economy at large and so on. But also we should not get ourselves into the mindset of, we just need to get back to where we were. Where we were was a country that had lagging productivity, deeply unresolved issues with Indigenous Canadians that led us in January to railroads not operating. I mean, this only seems like a good place to get back to because we're not there anymore. We need to kind of get to someplace different. And what we should use our imagination while we've got some time here to think, except it doesn't really feel like we get much time to think right now in the middle of this, but theoretically we're not working as hard, although it really doesn't feel that way. To think about what would we be doing differently if we had a chance once in a while to change things. We're going to spend, I'm sure governments are going to spend, as they are already spending, serious money helping get the economic recovery often in certain sectors and so on, and to reshape retail to make it a safe environment for people to be in, and restaurants and so on. What other changes can we buy as we come out of this thing we used to talk about, in healthcare reform, if you're going to put more money into healthcare, make sure you're buying some change. What kind of change do you want to buy? Better services, better outcomes, shorter waiting lists, whatever it is. What is it that from the economic situation we're in, going from where we are right now, which is, I don't know, maybe 75% of our economy operating, or 80%, to back to, eventually 100. Would we just want it to be exactly as it was, or what would we want to change if we could do that without impairing the economic recovery, which is a complication. I agree. The government talks about, let's make sure where we can to use it to encourage the green, the clean energy transition. I think that's a good idea, but we don't want to slow down the recovery in doing that. We want to shape the recovery in that direction, not without losing pace. So, the kind of work things, the workplace things that Linda's talking about, we can all think of lots of things that weren't perfect before. And as we kind of come out of this, is there anything we can do to help improve things so we actually end up, in a better place than we were at?
Thank you. So Scott, as a former president of the Treasury Board, you were involved in budget making. When do you think we might see a budget in this environment? And do you think the budget, what kind of timeframes would they have around a budget? And again, would you be painting? What kind of vision would you be painting, as Rick alluded to, for the economy? What is this? What would you be telling Canadians they could look for in 2021-22?
Well, look,
I'm pretty sure the finance minister is listening right now.
Absolutely, and I'll announce the date of the budget right now. No, in fact, I obviously don't know the date of the budget, but obviously there's going to be, when you're dealing with the $240 billion of spending in response to COVID-19, very important spending, and I support it actually. And we agree with Rick, it's the right, you're going to have probably a 14% deficit as a percent of GDP, up from around 1% this year, and a significant increase to our debt as a percentage of GDP. We're still going to be in good shape compared to our peer countries, but it's a significant and important investment. I don't know what when they'll bring forth a budget. The one thing I would say going forward, as this government and future governments deal with the fiscal hangover that results from this, I think we're going to have to look at alternative ways to finance a lot of the things we need as a country. We have massive infrastructure needs that are essential to our productivity as a country. I do not think we can rely on the taxpayer to fund those. And all three levels of government, if you consider the fiscal capacity of all three levels of government combined, those would pale in comparison to the infrastructure needs we have as a country. I am glad to see Michael Sabia now involved as chairman of the Infrastructure Bank of Canada. I hope that we see reform of infrastructure finance in Canada to adopt some of the Australian model of infrastructure finance, that we see our pension funds and other global pension funds and institutional investors, their expertise and capital harnessed to build better communities and a more productive economy. I do not think we need to further burden the taxpayer for all our infrastructure needs. I think we should get with the program and have a very robust public-private partnership environment where our world-class pension funds can build world-class infrastructure for Canadians.
Thank you, Scott. That definitely, again, it sounds like there's opportunities for transformation. So I've got lots of questions from the audience, terrific questions. And I can maybe put one to Linda. In fact, I have this one here that was directed right for Linda. And it's a question from Karen Tischler, and she says, she's an advocate for professionals trying to return to paid work. And she also hosts a podcast. And she asked you, Linda, do you think the COVID-19 situation will result in a much more interest in work sharing to reduce layoffs? And out of this, more flexible work methods like job sharing may become more mainstream for employers, as it already is the case in Europe. Can we see some European trends in Canada in the near future with respect to work sharing?
It's interesting. You know, it has been on the table every so often in Canada. It's never really found its footing. It's, I think, more difficult now because it's not like most professional jobs are 35 or 40 hours a week. They're kind of all the time. So to say that you're only doing half of that, you're doing 20 hours of it, is that much more difficult. Having said that, I think people would say yes. I think in every survey when people ask about time and, you know, what would you trade off for a little bit more time, there are people who say, yeah, I would give up some income for that. So I'd like to see it on the table. Having said that, the caveat to that is a lot of people just can't afford to give up any income, and they're living to the extent of their incomes. And the amount of people who can say, I will work part-time is unfortunately lower than it could be. So after this crisis, I think it'll be a real question, who can afford to take less?
Okay. Okay, so another question I could direct to Rick. It's none of these questions are easy. I should let all the panelists know. I'm sure glad that I don't have to answer any of them. So there's a question from Soto's Petreds, and Soto says, should we, and this is again a question for Rick, should we look at industries in decline and cut the cord to forced redirection? The government has provided wage and rent subsidies that may not prevent insolvency in the longer term anyway. Wouldn't those resources be better applied to building new businesses and industries? So, like, Rick, how do we manage this adjustment?
Well, that's a terrific question, and it's what I was alluding to, but more specific. You know, what could we do that where can we do things that we actually end up better off than we were going into this thing? I mentioned that one of the things Canadians don't like to talk about is we have lagging productivity as a country, and that leads to lagging competitiveness for some of our trade partners. And one of the answers to that is, unfortunately for Linda, automation and innovation. So there's an interplay there with employment. Although I think on the whole, you step back from it, automation has increased our wealth and increased employment, increased incomes. But that on the whole doesn't mean for every individual. So we've got dislocation. The point, the question though, is a good one, and people call it creative destruction. The process of industries that go into decline, that are usually accelerated by downturns in the economy. So what was already happening becomes more pronounced when you get into the kind of situation we're in. And governments could make the mistake, policymakers could make the mistake of saying, as I think sometimes we're a little too prone to, everybody needs help equally. Well, if you're really in a declining industry or a failing company, we probably don't want to just prop that up. We need to find a different solution to those particular circumstances. It goes to the shape of the economic policy side of this. How do we accelerate the things that we think have got the longest term potential and accelerate transitions where we can, not just abandon people to the fates of economic nature, but also not just treat everything like a level playing field and say everybody qualifies for the same thing. When the companies that are on growth spurts could probably do more on growth trends, could probably do more with the same amount of public support than companies that are on declining trends. I know that sounds harsh, and if there is declining trends that you allow to kind of go through a decline and transition, we need to have transition policies that will support that. We can't just abandon them. But equally, I think it would be a mistake to miss the opportunity to accelerate good things more strongly than just act like a safety net for everything equally.
Thank you, Rick. So a question for Scott, which again from this is an anonymous attendee, but it's a question I think, Scott, you're well suited to answer. How will massive government spending, which you've alluded to, both federally and provincially, affect future credit ratings and interest rates for government borrowing?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Canada is actually in an enviable fiscal position. And we can come out of this, I think, with an anomalous bump in deficit as a percentage of GDP for next year, and get back to a more normal fiscal framework going forward. And I think we're fine where we're going to end up in terms of debt as a percentage of GDP when this is over, particularly at long-term borrowing rates right now. I do think we have to be vigilant in terms of the integrity of the fiscal framework. And I do think we have to look at alternative ways to build the things we need. I mentioned it on infrastructure earlier, and I agree with what Linda said earlier regarding the importance of skills and training to get people through this. And you know, there has been, I think, quite an increase in people's individual productivity over the last few weeks as a result of some of the technological shift that people individually and collectively have embraced. And I think it would be a mistake for government to try to move people and companies back to what they were prior to this exactly. For instance, it is conceivable that there will be fewer people required for large parts of our labor market. And instead of incenting companies to keep on the same workforce they had prior, and effectively disincenting them to invest in technological transformation, which could enhance productivity, I think we should, you know, as Rick said, creative destruction, Schumpeter, bring, you know, that kind of principle in, allow it to happen, in fact, encourage it to happen, but as a backstop, making sure that we are there for our people. And that is where, and I don't believe, you know, I'm not saying bring in a guaranteed annual income. I'm saying that now is probably the best time we've ever had to have that discussion. And I bet you if we looked at all the funding all the money we're expending federally and provincially in terms of social investments, I bet you all those programs and the redundancy and overlap and inefficiency and administrative costs, and include the Canada Child Care benefit, the Canada Child benefit, the Whitby, all of these things together, I bet you the amount of money we're spending right now in aggregate would probably give us enough to actually have be quite close to providing what would be, for all intents and purposes, a guaranteed annual income. And we could do something that would be simpler, but until people have confidence and until they really feel that that the government has their backs on this, I think the recovery will be slow. So I think there's an economic imperative to take good care of the most vulnerable people right now.
Thank you, Scott. So, Linda, another question that I think is directed towards you, and I know the work that you've done in recent years about, again, looking at labor markets. This one starts out kind of where Scott left off earlier's discussion about the kind of the fiscal stresses that will exist in the nation. But the question moves towards how the relationship between executives and employees, and obviously in recent years, you've written about this. We've seen, you know, inequalities grow, and we've seen relatively large payments go to the kind of the top 1%, large, you know, income and wealth shifts. So the question is, one of the issues remains the excessive tax avoidance by large corporations, people call the tax gap, and the proportion of executive bonuses versus employee compensation. Do you think that, you know, is there something that can happen through, you know, this, you know, the shutdown of businesses and the lockout of workers? Like, could we end up in a different place in that relationship between, you know, those income gaps between workers and the people that run these big corporations?
Yeah, interesting question. You know, I'm not against productivity. In fact, I've really been distressed by Canada's productivity figures. So anything that lifts it is a good thing to me, including spending on technology, spending on investment. My concern, though, and it does come back to the workers, is that over the past few years or past decade or so, it seems that we've had a decoupling between gains in GDP and productivity and what workers get. And that's kind of new. We've always seen them move together. The economy does better, everybody does it better. So something's different this time around. In terms of, you know, how we come out of this crisis and whether this brings executives and the lowest paid workers closer together, I would like to think that we'd see some of that. It would certainly be really bad PR if we saw huge executive bonuses this year. basically closed or shutting down or the like. I don't know if I actually believe that will happen. When, as I said earlier, we saw a 10% gain in wages because the losses in jobs have been in those who make the least amount of money. And I think it would be naive to think that we're just going to close all these gaps. I think if anything, we're probably going to end up with gaps being larger.
So more work to do, and who maybe that pushes us more into the kind of programs that Scott was talking about, in terms of, you know, basic income style programs to continue that progress. So Rick, I have a question from Bruce Hyman, a well-known Canadian. He thanks everybody in the panel for a thoughtful conversation. Thanks, Bruce. But the question, Rick, for you is, like, and maybe for others, how do you think the Canada-US border should be normalized and return to accepting non-essential travelers? Both countries agreed to closure for non-essential travel. Is it necessary to have both countries agree on how they will reopen? How do you think this will play out? You travel a lot.
Oh, well, it's a very important question. You know, I alluded to what seems to be developing in the States, which is a lot of states relaxing their restrictions, while there's still pretty significant active outbreaks going on, particularly still in the Northeast. Connecticut and Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and so on. You know, I don't think it's going to have as dire a consequence in the southern states. I think there is a climate-related effect to this. At least that's what I read from the experts about that. But I think the northern tier states have got to be careful. Of course, those are the ones that are right on our border. So Canadians are going to be nervous about opening that border too quickly, I think, is the basic truth of it. Unless we see that the outbreaks have really settled down in in the places where people are traveling to and from in the United States. You know, it's stayed open for essential goods and cargo and essential services and so on, and a certain category of diplomats and journalists and so on. But I'm not sure that there's a big ambition on the Canadian side of that border to really open it up a whole lot more until we see. It goes back to the earliest discussion we had in this webinar. Scott was talking about the pandemic and the recovery. I mean, if opening the border leads us to have in Canada a more rapid escalation in new cases, I think people would be against it, and I think they're not sure that that's not the case today.
Interesting. Yeah. So actually, another question, Scott. Like, you've talked a few times about potential for policy change, you know, in governments. There's a few questions from our listeners about pharmacare. So, I mean, the question basically is, what about a national pharmacare program? This is a question from Cheryl-Ann Simoneau. A resolution was passed in the House of Commons unanimously on March 12, 2020, but then everything was suspended. Will there be an appetite for these sort of bigger ticket items like national pharmacare, in addition to work, not work sharing, but work sharing and maybe more income support type programs? Where do you think national pharmacare will be in 2021-22?
It's difficult to say, and it may shape what kind of national pharmacare we end up seeing. There are proponents calling for a totally, publicly funded universal system that doesn't involve the private sector. That has a huge fiscal impact, and I think quite possibly, if you look at what the real issue is the people who don't have coverage now. So finding a way to help those people who don't have coverage without disrupting those people who already have coverage may be more cost effective and still achieve the public policy objective. So I personally would like to see the government explore that kind of approach, which would be less so I think that might be where we end up, but it's difficult to say. There will be those who want to see 100% public universal system. I think we should just be pragmatic and help the people who need coverage, and recognize that there is a private sector and efficient delivery model that's actually working quite well for a lot of Canadians, and allow that to continue to do its thing.
I think that's really important. You know, if you ranked all the different things you could ask governments to possibly do that would improve the quality of Canadian lives, creating a new universal pharmaceutical pharmacare program would probably be low on that list compared to some of the other things that we've been talking about here. How do we close the gap for workers who are being displaced in this economy? How do we help people transition to new models of working, work sharing, or, you know, being trained for post-automation work and so on? How do we close the gap in terms of rural access to the kind of high-speed internet that's necessary for what we're doing here today? So that works more. Like, there's a whole long list of things that I think are coming into focus a little bit as a result of the circumstance we're in. You know, with the income supports being, I think, probably at the top of that list. And on the pharmacare side, we should really just concentrate on addressing the gaps rather than overhauling the system that's kind of 85% working. We got other things that are so much more important that really should be. The social contract between the wealthiest in the country and the lowest is not as in dire shape in Canada as it is in our neighbor to the south. But that doesn't mean it's not an issue. We should figure out what we can do about that doesn't create disincentives to work. I've always liked the idea of some kind of, you know, guaranteed basic income idea, but I understand that it needs to be done in an intelligent way. You know, of course, our lifetime, you know, we've seen the discussion go from universality for these kind of programs to really targeting from a baby bonus that everybody got, whether they were wealthy or not, wealthy or disadvantaged, to child tax benefits that are highly targeted and had a lot to do with raising income standards for lowest paid Canadians, lowest income Canadians. We should continue on down those roads, and we should continue being creative in public policy to support people who are at the edge of the workforce and, you know, prone to being dislocated when there's any kind of change, whether it's a recession or technology changes and so on. Figure out what to do with folks like that. Either it's mobility or training or work sharing, or, you know, what we can do with public policy and income programs. Sorry, Linda, it's really your area, so I'll just toss the ball towards you. But but I think we should be open-minded about this. It's part of the creative destruction discussion. You know, what can we do that makes our society? What are we learning from this, and what are our accumulated knowledge before and during this crisis that we can apply to improving things in the future?
So maybe we could end with almost where Rick left off, and just a final question. We're down to about 3 minutes, and maybe a minute each, and we can start with Linda. And there was a question from the audience that picked up on something that Rick had said earlier about the possibilities for profound, lasting changes. And we had a global financial crisis 12 years ago. It certainly brought some significant changes in the financial industry, our understanding of risk and regulation. Like, coming out of this is a global health pandemic. Like, what do you think, one or two sort of profound, changes that we might experience? Could be in the workplace or could be elsewhere. We'll start with Linda, and then we'll go to Scott, and we'll end with Rick, because this question I almost started with Rick. What are those profound changes that we might look forward to 5 or 10 years from now?
Starting with me, I'm going to stick to work. I think we're going to question every single thing about it. The setup we had, which was everyone goes to the office, goes to the factory, made sense for a number of years. It doesn't have to make sense now. We don't have to go there, but we have to change everything about our thinking, because work gave us somewhere to go. It gave us social interaction. We were structured around meetings where we're all together. Now we're going to sufficient way to do that for companies, for the environment, for families, for society. Everything's on the table. I think we could come out in a healthier and better place, but it'll be difficult to get there.
Okay, see that, Scott? That's Linda's not a politician, but she knows how to kind of instill optimism that positive change is coming. And okay, you are a politician. Like, what profound changes can we look forward to? Obviously, my hairline's not going to change. You've already criticized that before the show even got started.
Well, it's just that some of us have to spend more time thinking about our hair for these video things than you do. That's all. A couple things. One is that there are positives coming out of this terrible crisis that we should not ignore in terms of the impact on our efficiency and potential strengthening or improvement of our quality of life by being able to work from home more frequently, have more flexibility in terms of workforce or workplace transformation. I think that, long-term costs for companies could actually be reduced. You'll see a change in terms of how we approach things like commercial real estate. It's going to have an impact on business travel. All of those. My caution would be in terms of government programs is to not try to slow down those changes, because some of those were already occurring before this pandemic. This is simply accelerating these changes, and they could actually have some positive impact. Think about it. If there is less travel related to work, what that might do in terms of our carbon footprint, in terms of sustainability, in terms of inclusion, for Canadians with disabilities who have long wanted to work from home more often. Well, maybe this is going to result in a mindset shift, or in terms of how we think about that, in terms of not stigmatizing people who are working from their homes, but in actually recognizing it as being normal and productive. So I think we should really focus on addressing people's insecurities at this time to help and encourage them to re-enter the economy. We've never seen something where the Canadian economy effectively shut down overnight before. The fact that it has gotten back to where it is today in terms of functioning is actually quite remarkable. Think if this had happened 20 years ago, and we had phones and faxes, or 25 years ago, say, and what the impact would have been. So I think we're taking for granted a lot of the advancements we've seen over the last couple of decades in terms of technology. And we actually have to use this opportunity to do more. Finally, on creative, their destruction, there's something called the Creative Destruction Lab, CDL, which started at U of T, but there's one at Dalhousie University and Memorial in Atlantic, Canada, and it's across. It's something that's really important in terms of the startup ecosystem for the country. During this time, our startup ecosystem is really imperiled, and now it's going to be really important for governments and business to recognize the importance of that startup community and to not abandon it at this critical time. And so governments are, I think this is going to be an area of important focus, and that is that we help backstop our startup community through this, because they are going to be the drivers of change on which we will depend for our prosperity in the future.
That's fantastic, Scott. Actually, one of the questions we didn't get to from the audience dealt with startups, so we're glad that you touched on that. So Rick, we're ending with you, and there's definitely a wave of optimism. Okay, Scott wants to get back in.
Just one thing, you called me a politician. I was very proud to be a politician for 22 years, but I'm no longer a politician. Just correct.
Yeah, we know you returned to your business roots. And so, Rick, like Scott, you've been inside business, inside politics. This question started with you really about profound changes. 5-10 years from now, Rick, what do you think we'll be talking about? What are the lessons learned? What profound changes will we be living through?
It's first of all, I won't repeat what Linda and Scott have just said. I agree with many of the observations that they've made, so I won't recite the same list. But I think we're going to, I referred to it a little bit earlier, I think we're going to invest more in rural and less urban residents, and more in people who work in those kind of settings, because I think we're discovering that those have more value than we probably think. And one of my family members is a teacher who teaches in a rural area. I live in an urban area, and our son, made the transition to online schooling quite easily, and it seems to be actually working. So who knows? We'll see, what the marks look like next year. But it seems to be functioning. But in a rural setting, my brother-in-law tells me that, half the homes have acceptable video connections like what we're talking about, and distance learning is actually possible. And this is in rural Eastern Ontario. And the other half don't. So right away, basically an economic cleavage that exists there. So we can settle that. We can address that with technology. I think that's one of the things we're probably going to do as a country, is invest in that area. I think that most of the Western democracies, Canada, States, and so on, Europe, are going to invest in reshoring. The wake-up calls we've had about supply chains, and particularly the just-in-time nature of a global supply chain, has reminded us that that's not always a good idea for every single thing that you actually need for daily life. And even in the relationship between Canada and the States, which is, famously one of the closest in the world historically and so on, we had some shocks there. So those are wake-up calls. I think that we're going to see it will take more dollars per unit to cause us to buy from abroad than it used to. And that gap has been narrowing anyway. So I think we're going to see things brought closer to home, where we have more exposure or less risk, I guess is a better way of putting it, to what's going on. Failing that, where we do buy offshore, we'll probably stockpile more. We'll probably not be as inclined to just in time. We'll probably warehouse more stuff of things that we want to make sure we're not going to run out of in 30 or 60 or 90 days, as opposed to what time's the truck coming today so I can finish making this automobile. So I think that's going to happen. But I would bet that of all the things, we haven't really talked about it because it's not really a business thing, except if you're in a particular sector. But I think one of the most profound things we're probably going to do as a country, one of the most expensive public policy changes we're going to make, is how we deal with elderly in care situations. Because that's obviously, for Canada, if this story is kind of in the process of ending in some fashion, even if it phases out over a longer period of time and has more waves, if what we know now is most of what happens, the biggest tragedy here will be what happened with elderly people in long-term, in government care. If not in government-operated facilities, at least government-regulated facilities. And this has been a huge wake-up call to how badly that situation has not been designed and practiced. So I think there's going to be some huge changes there, and there's probably a big economic opportunity for people who want to invest in that, provided that we can get the regulatory, starting with who owns that facility. Is it going to get all brought into the public sector, which some people will advocate right away, or is it going to remain a hybrid of public and private services, but where the quality of them, really, whether they're public or private, is raised quite significantly? I think that's going to be one of the big changes. I think that basically mobility, transportation, transit, would you want to get on a crowded subway train today anywhere? Well, there's not crowded subway trains in very many places in Canada. Are you ready to get onto a crowded subway train in Toronto or Montreal? I bet not. Or a crowded plane for that matter. So what are we going to do about that? There's, we're kind of, we can't really redesign those things to, give people 6 feet of distance on a subway car or a bus, really. So what are we going to do? I mean, that goes back to, hoping that there's a cure or a treatment or a vaccine that deals with this, which we haven't really talked about very much here. And all we can do is really hope for that. And I think people are being actually a little bit too optimistic, but we want to end on an optimistic note, so I won't go down that path. Anyway, I think those changes that we've all been talking about are all opportunities for good, as well as for bad. And I think we're a country and a people who like to think positively and constructively about these things. And I think there are going to be a lot of positive changes come out of this.
Thank you, Rick. So again, I think a nice way of ending. We lots of questions, but a lot of change that could predict, that's going to come. And so I just really want to thank our guests today for taking, an hour out of their day, their busy schedules, for sharing it with, hundreds and hundreds of people that were listening to this program and will continue to listen. I just want to start again for Linda Nazareth from Relentless Economics and a fellow at Macdonald Laurier Institute. Like Linda also has a podcast starting on June 1st. Linda, and it's the Work in the Future podcast, and you can get that at relentlesseconomics.com. Huge thank you, Linda, to Mr. Brison, the Honorable Scott Brison, no longer a politician now, a very important person, Vice Chair of Investment and Corporate Banking at the Bank of Montreal. Just a huge thank you. So nice to reconnect with Scott. For Rick, just so great to connect with you. Rick Anderson from Earnscliffe, and just thank you for just great inputs from everybody. On behalf of my partners, Canada 2020, Center for Global Progress, and my colleagues at IFSD, many thanks. Stay healthy and look forward to reconnecting with you in the future. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.